To start with, it's something that the country cannot afford. If you take into consideration that we have other dire means that other dire needs that we need to meet, and if you take into consideration that the World Bank loan that you actually referred to right now, it's something that at the end of the day, it's going to come from our fiscus, and that translates into the taxes that we are going to be paying. So what we believe civil society is that we are saying that we shouldn't be taking on grants or loans that are actually going to further tie us into a situation where we have to continuously be using our fiscus. There's something very interesting that was mentioned by the president this afternoon when he was talking about the commitments that were made from the Paris Agreement. The commitments that were made was incentivizing countries, especially less developed countries, and that includes, South Africa, in terms of the $100 billion that he was referring to, and that has not been forthcoming. And that is one of the things that we need to focus on, because when the Paris Agreement was actually agreed upon, those were one of the conditions that were made, because it was part of the recognition that the so-called developed countries now have actually had a head start in terms of their own development through this carbon-intensive way of developing, and the way of incentivizing countries like us, or countries that that are not so well developed, is to say that don't go through the path that we have taken to become carbon intensive so that we get to the development. But however, we can find less carbon ways, and that is the funding that was actually meant to come through. Now we are seeing the World Bank actually coming, Eskom taking a loan from the World Bank in terms of getting into the just transition. And as civil society, we feel that this is not the route that we should actually be taking, because as you rightfully said, Tsepiso, at the end of the day, this loan that we're taking is going to cost the fiscus, and when it costs the fiscus, at the end of the day, it translates into less service delivery that the country needs.
So Ms. Munodia was saying that as a commission, they did discuss the realities that as much as money is being put in, it's some skin in the game by developed nations, it is nowhere near enough. And just looking at what some analysts have suggested, that upfront financing is key, that African countries need reliable financing options that will maximize return on investment. Do we have that in this case? And do we have options of grants and soft loans with flexible targets for private financing goals?
Financing is key, as you rightfully say, Tsepiso. Financing is key, but it doesn't mean that it needs to lock the so-called developing countries into further debt. And that's one of the things that we need to take into consideration, irrespective of whatever financial instruments or mechanisms that are actually being used for us to get out of this carbon-intensive economies that we are developing right now. So that tells us that with the agreement as that was made in the Paris Agreement, it tells us that what is the commitment that the so-called developed countries have actually made, and what have they delivered? And the president alluded to that. So it comes back to the fact that there's this unequal balance in terms of how do we commit to climate change, and how do we commit to decarbonizing our economies. And that tells you that the Global South will forever continuously be sidetracked when it comes to this development that we are talking about, or the moving away from this carbon intensive. And we are seeing now with the Ukraine crisis, the Russian crisis, that most of the so-called developed countries in Europe, the US, included, are actually moving now to a state where they are going back to this carbon intensive economy that we are seeing. And that tells you there's a less commitment to actually curbing the climate change issue. And with the latest report that has been released by the scientists, it's now telling us that we're actually gone beyond the threshold of the 1.5 degrees that have been agreed by the Paris Agreement. And that tells you that we don't have enough commitment to actually make it a point that the developed countries versus the developing countries, that they don't go into a debt where they can't actually, get out of it.
And it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, you pointed out in terms of the Paris agreements, part of the criticism has been those commitments were made by individual nations. And if we see what happened in Glasgow, how much confidence can we have in the fact that developed nations will actually come to the party and meet these commitments that they've made? In terms of financing, the financial goal was at 700 billion US dollars in Glasgow. And as you say, the geopolitical realities, if we were saying we were taking advantage of not only COVID-19, but the current circumstances to be more self-reliant, are we not going to find ourselves in a position where we are now exporting energy imperatives that we would have had in our own countries? Just share your thoughts on me, or am I way off course here? Because we're embarking on this, the UN Economic Commission for Africa saying, great move, everybody should emulate South Africa. But what we're doing is dismantling these fuel sources for those that are long in the making.
To start with, Tsepiso, I just need to emphasize that the just transition is something that we strongly believe in, because we do understand that it has to take us from the current climate crisis that we are in right now to a level where we can actually mitigate or at least reduce, if not get rid of, the climate crisis in which we are. And at the same time, we're also cognizant of the fact that Africa needs to develop. But the question is, we are developing at what cost? And which is why we're saying that when it comes to fossil fuels and when it comes to the support that is actually required for the African continent, and I'm now going to be more specific on the African continent, for the African continent to actually move from where it is to continue being a developmental state, or a continent, to a point where we can also be able to provide the jobs, we can also provide the services that are required by communities on the African continent. But however, we also need to, to acknowledge the historical perspective. The historical perspective is that the climate change imperative that we are actually experiencing right now has, to a minimal degree, been created by the African continent, but to a maximum degree has been created by the so-called developing countries. And which is why the Paris Agreement was very much important for us to actually sit down and say that in terms of your own responsibilities, what contribution can you make so that we can get to a position where we don't stop development of states as well as countries and continents, but we continue that, but at what rate? And that rate is about how do we bring down our carbon intensive way of growing. And that is where so far we have seen that there has been this disparity of us not reaching or not about reaching, but also committing and keeping to those commitments of what we agree that should be delivered by the global north and the global south, so that we can be in a situation where we don't get above the 1.5 degree threshold. And that 1.5 degree threshold does not only impact Africa alone, it also impacts the global north. It's a global phenomenon that, which according to science, and it's not something that civil society is thumb-sucking and saying that, no, we don't want coal, we don't want this. It is based on science, and that science is simply telling us that we cannot go beyond that threshold. And as a result, the agreements, the global agreements that are being made, are trying to meet that threshold so that we don't go beyond it. But however, in terms of the contributions that have been made historically and currently by the different states and continents tell us that the global north has to come to the party.